Caddo Nation and the Wichita and affiliated tribes. And today, Oklahoma is home to 39 federally recognized Native nations, which reside there as a result of settler and colonial forced relocation.
Our lab at the University of Oklahoma is called the LAMR, or the Labs of Molecular Anthropology and Microbiome Research. And one of the primary research themes of our lab group is understanding the reciprocal relationships between humans, non-human animals, and their environment. We like to study these systems synergistically rather than as separate components, so it's a lot of interdisciplinary collaborative research. And one recently published example of this type of synergistic research is Henson et al. So this is our friend Lauren Henson. In 2021, they showed that grizzly bear population genetic structure matches First Nations language families in British Columbia. And these population structure groups can't be explained by geographic barriers. I think this is a really nice illustration of how cultural and biological diversity are interrelated. So some of the press coverage of this work was a little bit sensationalized, but actually the findings weren't really surprising to Lauren's team. It was a First Nations collective group focusing on bear conservation. One of the paper's co-authors is Jennifer Wakas of the Aleutians Nation, and she said that she understands firsthand that bears and humans have a lot of the same resource needs in terms of habitat, food, and other resources. And so this interrelatedness means that Canada should really manage resources with both the bears and humans in mind. And so the Aleutians Nation is adjusting their salmon harvest to support bears' needs as well as their own. So our specific research project is aimed at understanding how climate change throughout the Holocene, or about the last 12,000 years, has affected Bering Sea bears as well as human-bear relationships here in Unalaska. So we know that bears play significant roles in a lot of indigenous nations. In North America, bears are featured prominently in a lot of stories. They're considered kin or as non-human persons by a lot of nations. In addition to providing food and raw material for clothing, bedding, bear teeth and claws are worn as jewelry and used in ceremonies as well. So on the slide you can see a variety of different bear representations in contemporary artwork, as well as Nupiaq muklux, and this is an Osage bear claw necklace at the San Noble Museum. So for Alutiiq people, whose ancestral lines are shown in periwinkle, including the Alaska Peninsula and the Kodiak Archipelago, bears were an especially important source of food and raw materials. On Kodiak Island, bears are currently the largest land animal, and they were the only large land animal before deer were introduced. And the Alutiiq use bear intestines for waterproof clothing, to waterproof their kayaks and for bags. So they use the bones to make tools and teeth for jewelry and hides for bedding. And you can see a child's bear gut jacket that's at the Burke Museum shown on the left. So unlike the Alaskan Peninsula, here in Unalaska, there's no published evidence that bears have ever lived. We're about 60 miles west of Unangax Island, where brown bears do live, and are approximately 200 miles south of the Pribilof Islands, which is the furthest south that we're aware of sea ice being present since human habitation 9,000 or 10,000 years in the past. So it's therefore not surprising that modern-day Unanga don't have a cultural practice of bear use. So based on oral traditions and items found in archaeological sites, we know that Unangan ancestors utilized marine resources, including seals, whales, and sea lions, as well as fish, birds, mollusks, and wild plants.
So this is the Margaret Bay site. This is an archaeological site that is actually right by the Museum of the Aleutians. If you go out onto the back, onto the porch, and you kind of look up onto that hill, you can see the ditch where they originally excavated this site in the late 90s. So this site was dug up by Nett and Davis, and they found a habitation site there. They found up to 23,000 fossil remains, they found a lot of tools, and then they found some charcoal, and they radiocarbon dated this site to roughly 4,700 years old. Of the 23,000 mammal bones, these were identified by Brian Davis, so 5,000 of them were identifiable enough that he was able to find 2% of those which were from bears. And he used the comparative samples at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Museum. He estimated that there were roughly 4 polar bears and several brown bears in this sample, and also he identified a lot of ice-loving species, which kind of ties into our next part here. So they were hypothesizing, because of these ice-loving species such as walrus and ring seal, that perhaps the ice came further south than previously estimated. So this darker gray here shows the modern day reach of sea ice versus what their hypothesis was. And a lot of the tools that they found there were a little weird, a little wonky, and a little different from what they had found previously in this area. So we see a change in the toolkit and also a change in the mammal resources that they were using in this time, which they suggest was caused by this climate change. This is also further evidence of this is from the pollen samples from this area. So over on the graph over there, is that my right side? My right side. We can see that roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, right about the time that they radiocarbon dated the site, 4,700 years ago, there was this dip in the temperatures which may have caused this expansion of the sea ice.
So this brings us up to kind of present day knowledge about the change in environments during this time. Catherine West from Boston University and Mike Etnier from Western Washington University are both zooarchaeologists, which means they study human-animal interactions over time. And they've been working on this puzzle to see if there's other evidence of neoglacial ice here in Unalaska. They actually specialize in invertebrates, specifically mollusks, seals, and birds, and they contacted us to study these proposed bare bones. On the right, you can see pictures of two mandibles, and the bottom is a harbor seal that has, so to speak here, two three sockets, and ring seal that has round, sort of regular shaped. So our goal as part of this ongoing sea ice project is to figure out conclusively what species of bear the bones belong to, and to determine which contemporary or modern day population they are most closely related to. And I'm also personally interested to find out what the genetic diversity of those populations was at that time, especially for polar bears, because their populations might have increased as well as while the sea ice was expanding. I'm also interested to find out whether there's evidence of hybridization or gene flow between brown bears and polar bears. If their populations did overlap in this area at that time, they probably would have been exchanging genetic material.
And to figure all of this out, we started by taking pictures and 3D scans of all of our bones, and then we did morphometrics. So we took measurements of our bones and then compared them to measurements that I took from known polar bear and brown bear samples that were at the Sam Noble and Smithsonian Museums of Natural History. We then subsampled these bones, meaning we took bits and pieces and sent them off for further analysis. So we did isotopic analysis, which is looking at the carbon dating at UC Irvine, and then we also had them do bulk isotope analysis, which is looking at the nitrogen and carbon-13 ratios inside of these bones to kind of reconstruct their diet and their environment that these bears are living in. And then we also did DNA sequencing, so we did whole genome enrichment using the ancient DNA lab at Lamammer. And then we also took DNA from modern bear samples, also from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and we used that modern DNA to enrich or increase the quality of the ancient bear DNA. So just based on size and shape alone, unfortunately our data wasn't super conclusive. So brown bears and polar bears are very closely related. Polar bears are basically just white brown bears whenever you're looking at the rest of their body. They're also up to 50% sexually dimorphic. So just from like a random finger bone, it's nearly impossible to tell if it came from a really big male brown bear or perhaps a small female polar bear. So these are the graphic representations that I made based on the hundreds of measurements that I took from all of these bones. And over on the right side is a PCA that I made of the metacarpal measurements. So based on this, we can kind of see trends between the different populations. So the blue is the brown bear, the red is the polar bear, the silver are the hybrid bears, and then the orange are the bears from Margaret Bay. So just from this, we can see they're kind of trending with the brown bears, but unfortunately, the majority of our data kind of looked like this. So these are measurements I took of the canine teeth, and they're just all over the place. So from measurements alone, they were not statistically significant, and we were not able to get a determinative species ID from this. That is also because the majority of our elements were post-cranial, so neck down, and the skull is the most useful when trying to determine species. But we did get a chunk of the skull, which is this fancy little mandible right there. And that mandible is really weird. So just by looking at shape alone, we can say that this is most likely from a polar bear. Yes, please pass it around. So the molars are very narrow, they're very small, and the bone itself is fairly thin. These are characteristics that we associate with the polar bear mandible. They're eating a lot of soft, fleshy fats diet versus a brown bear, which is eating a lot of grass, a lot of seeds. They have very chunky molars and a very robust jaw. So characteristically, size-wise, this is most likely a polar bear, but these molars are really, really worn down. They're nearly flat to the bone, which is not something that we typically see in polar bears, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to look at some other surface features to see what else I could figure out from these bones. So I did characterization and perimortem aging. I wanted to figure out how old these bears were when they died. And we can see that based on growth plate fusion and tooth eruption. So as you grow in age, your bones grow in age with you, except they fuse at different points in your life. So this is a metacarpal, and it's fully fused. So I know that it must have come from a bear that was at least 4 years old. Also looking at tooth eruption, obviously if I have a baby tooth, that must have come from a baby bear versus, in a fully erupted adult canine. So then I took our bones, aged them, and then put them into 4 separate age groups. And then I looked at what elements were represented in each of these four age groups, and I determined how many bears we must have had in our sample. And so that number was 6. And then I also wanted to see what else I could figure out. So there were these really weird protuberances on the ventral side of the metacarpal, as well as this really rough growth. Towards the joint, which is arthritis. So when Brian Davis was first looking at these bones, he argued that this was most likely caused by walking on hard surfaces, which is something that we would see in brown bears, rather than polar bears, which are walking on nice, soft, fluffy snow. So the metacarpal is most likely from a brown bear. We also want to look at any cut marks or any human modification of these bones. And we did find cut marks on the scapula, radius, phalanges, metacarpals, and then the mandible. We took pictures of these very beautiful, shallow parallel cuts, and then we sent them off to a zoo archaeologist at OU, Dr. Bethke. She confirmed that these are in fact cut marks. And based on where they're located near the joints, she said that it's most consistent with butchery and disarticulation, so they're harvesting the meat from these bears. But then the cuts near the fingers, the phalanges, the metacarpals is also most likely from skinning, so they're trying to get the fur and get the fur from in between the fingers. So. Unfortunately, we did not find any evidence that they were using these bones for jewelry or tools or anything like that. So, so these are the results of our isotopic analysis. So you are what you eat, quite literally. By looking at the concentration of the elements that are in your bones, we can kind of guess what you ate when you were alive. So over here on the y-axis is my nitrogen values. As you go up the food chain, the nitrogen values increase. So lower on the chart is something we would expect something that's low on the food chain, like a rabbit, versus something that would be high on the chart is high on the food chain, like an eagle that is eating that rabbit. And then my carbon value, which is down here on my x-axis, is determined by where the carbon is coming from. So from a terrestrial environment, on the right is carbon that would have come from grass, versus over here on the left is carbon that would have come from something like kelp that belongs to the ocean. So these stars represent the isotope values that we got from 6 of our different bones. 4 of them are plotting kind of omnivorous, land-dwelling, which is consistent with what we would expect to find in a brown bear, versus 2, which are very high on the food chain, eating a lot of marine resources, which is what we would expect from a polar bear. So,
and we were right about the mandible. It's one of those polar bears.
Yes.
So the other piece of data that we got from UC Irvine was radiocarbon dates. And this is really interesting that it actually pushed back the estimated date of the Margaret Bay site by about 1,000 years. So rather than 4,700, we found that they're about 5,500 years before present. And this even more closely overlaps with that onset of cooling between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, the new glacial that we talked about. And one thing I wanted to point out is you can see in these bones here and also the original pictures is that the bones are remarkably well preserved. There's not a lot of weathering. You can see a lot of the features are preserved in this shell midden. They're really beautiful, which leads us to our DNA analysis work. It's currently ongoing. I do have low coverage, which means a shallow or preliminary DNA sequencing, shotgun, and those whole genome enrichments that Kaylee was talking about for 33 of the Unalaska bear bones as well as 16 additional historical and modern bears from Unangax Island and the Alaska Peninsula, and then polar bears from St. Paul. And then on the left is my complete genomic data set. So fortunately for us, bears are really popular to study. So we have a lot of full genomes that are published for bears from all over the world, which serves as a really great reference so that it'll be able to tell us where these Unalaska bears most likely originated from by looking at the modern population that they're most closely related to. So with the low coverage data, I was able to get full mitochondrial genomes at least. Their mitochondrial genomes are smaller than nuclear genomes, so with those data, I was able to get full mitochondrial genomes. And I found out that 31 of all of these elements are from brown bears, and then 2 are from polar bears. So the 2 that we happen to send for radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis, those 2 are the polar bears. So that was the mandible and the sacral vertebra, the sacrum here. The other thing that we noticed is that the data are remarkably good. It may not sound like a lot, but 22% of the sequences that we got from the samples came from bear. So versus bacterial contaminants or other sort of environmental contaminants. So the data were really nice. And the enrichment that we did with the modern DNA actually really increased the representation. So we were able to go from just 10x depth of data coverage for the mitogenomes to 500 times. So we're really, really confident about the quality of those mitochondrial genomes and our species identification. So we have only preliminary conclusions at this point, and I'm really interested, now that we've given you the evidence, to hear what you guys think about it. But my takeaways are that we have strong evidence of polar bear presence here in Unalaska. Based on the isotopes and the mitochondrial DNA sequences that I have, it looks like we have 2 different individuals represented in our sample. Along with the presence of ring seals and walruses, this could indicate that sea ice was present here around 5,000 years ago. The presence of ice could also have facilitated dispersal of brown bears from neighboring islands here, so they could have had an established population. And the new toolkit associated with this time period could indicate a change of culture associated with environmental change as well. So what does this tell us about bears and human bear relationships? In our assemblage, we identified this bear. So keep in mind this bone, which is a complete fetus femur. So it's true to size. It's not shrunk down. This is an actual bone in our collection. And so this to me suggests that butchering did occur in place. That could explain why the presence of this fetus bone. Unalaska bears and Kodiak bears are huge. They're too big to really move via kayak, but it has been suggested that it's possible that they could have been hunted during hunting trips and then pulled in by floats via boat. So that's also possible. It's technically also possible that the bones were a result of the trade. Based on the number and the pieces of elements that they are, it's more suggestive to me either of long distance hunting trips or that they had an established population here. So if brown bear and polar bear habitats did overlap, it is possible that they hybridize. So if I do find evidence of hybridization, that would be sort of positive evidence supporting the presence of populations here, although it wouldn't be entirely conclusive. And for the hybridization testing, I need to do deeper DNA sequencing. So, not to throw us all off, but this spring in April, we were thrown a little bit of a curveball, which was we got 6 additional bear samples from a different archaeological site. So this is the Unangax Bridge site. We followed the exact same protocols and methods that we did for the Margaret Bay site bears, and we found that all 6 of the bones were from brown bears. And these were actually dated to 2,800 years ago. So now we have 2 different time periods, both containing brown bears. And does this change like the implications or how we're thinking about this? To me, it's even more suggestive that there was a brown bear population here, that the Unangax ancestors were utilizing bears over a long period of time, and that sometime after 2,800 years ago, this population went extinct. Or is it possible that there were long distance hunting trips was common practice? I'm not sure. And so how can we answer these questions? My personal next steps are going to be this deeper DNA sequencing to look for hybridization and what population those bears are closely related to. I also want to see if there's evidence of decreased genetic diversity in brown bears, which would be consistent with sort of like a population expansion. The front of an expanding population has lower genetic diversity than established bigger populations. Similarly, with polar bears, I'll look at genetic diversity and also what modern population they're most closely related to. There's also questions that DNA can't answer for us. If Unangan ancestors traveled to hunt brown bears, under what circumstances would they have done that? Why would they be doing that? And are there archaeological sites from neighboring islands like Unangax so that we can compare the frequency of bears there versus here and see if that gives us some more information? Finally, I was able to recover pretty good nuclear sequence data, although it's shallow and I need to do more. So that suggests that I might be able to get whole genome bisulfite sequence data. So we're starting to understand that sometimes phenotypes, the physical representation, can change based on the methylation in our genes. And so I want to look at these neoglacial bears, the 2,800-year-old bears, historical bears, and modern bears, and compare the methylation patterns in specific genes to see if we can see any sort of change that might be associated with climate change or physiological adaptations to climate change. It would give us even more information.
So when we're thinking about climate change, obviously we're thinking about polar bears here and how polar bears are affected by this climate change. So I mentioned that the molars on our mandible were really, really worn down. But this is actually something that we do see in polar bears today in Canada. As they're starting to travel further south, they're not eating what they typically eat. They're getting into trash, they're not where they're supposed to be. And so here are two modern bear samples from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This top mandible is from a polar bear. As you can see, these are absolutely beautiful molars. They're still very sharp, very clean. There's not a whole lot of wear and tear, even though this came from an older bear. Versus this down here is something from, this is a brown bear. And what we see here is a lot of where the molars are super flat, the crowns of the teeth are chipped and broken, which is what we tend to see with these polar bears that are moving further south. They're eating a brown bear diet, which is exactly what we see in our mandible as well. And then the other part of this project are the 3D models, which you guys are passing around and playing with just as the kids play with them. So a standard part of working with ancient bones is taking pictures and taking 3D scans of them to preserve their shape and make it accessible for libraries and museums before we have to take pieces from them. But I went ahead and I took these 3D scans and I made 3D models of each of them, which allows for a hands-on supplement to this educational outreach activity that I made. So we are using this at camp. We're going to be giving it to the museum for their use. We've also used this several times in Oklahoma, and I uploaded all of this to Thingiverse, which is an online 3D library. So teachers from all over the world, it's open access and it's completely free for them to download and print these and use them wherever. So these are pictures of students in Oklahoma working through the exact same packet that the kids at camp are working through right now, where they get to be archaeologists for a day, and they get to ask themselves the exact same questions that we ask whenever we're working with these bones. What species did they come from? Where did they come from? And then they're also given some background information about the Unanga cultural practices to kind of understand the people that were really interacting with these bones.
So this was a lot, so I just wanted to give you a chance to absorb it for a second. And I'm going to reiterate some of the conclusions that I've kind of drawn from these pieces of evidence, which are that polar bears and brown bears were utilized by Unangan ancestors. A lot of evidence that we have supports the sea ice expansion and the neoglacial hypothesis. Changing environmental conditions, changing hunting technologies, the presence of two polar bears as well as those ringed seals and walruses. If our polar bears are closely related to modern-day Bering Sea bears, this could indicate expansion, so would support the sea ice hypothesis. If they're closely related to bears in Canada or Greenland or somewhere far away, would be more indicative of trade. The presence of brown bears to me is a little bit less clear. It could be related to the presence of sea ice that could have facilitated dispersal, but it could also be due to long-distance hunting trips, we're not sure. So we need more information to figure this out. The testing for hybridization does give us this additional piece of information because brown bears otherwise would not have encountered polar bears and they should not have a lot of polar bear genes. If we do see hybridization, this is also supportive of that presence of a population that overlapped with polar bears. And so we would like to invite you to tell us what you think based on evidence that we've given you.
We would also invite you guys to share some cultural knowledge if you have any about bears and how maybe Unanga were interacting with bears and stories, which would also kind of help us understand the cultural significance and why they would have gone so far out of their way for these bears.
Yeah. So that's all I have for you, and so we'd like to thank you a lot for taking your evening to listen to us. And I would like to acknowledge our funders. So we received funding from the University of Oklahoma and the National Science Foundation, without which we wouldn't have been able to travel here. And a lot of thanks to the Museum of the Aleutians and Thomas for hosting us here tonight. Thank you for that. And also many thanks to the tribe and Camp Kenai for allowing us to come and share our bear activity with the youth. We've learned a lot from the students and also from the other mentors. And finally, the work wouldn't be possible without the support of the Unalaska Corporation that allowed us to take samples from the bones and process those. Thank you.
Thank you.
What do you think? I'm curious if anyone has any hypotheses.
Yes.
So with the arthritis of the feet, with the ground down teeth, is it possible they were held in captivity?
That is not even something that I had thought about.
I don't agree with you either.
I don't know. I've never heard of bears being held in captivity like in ancient times before there were like zoos like we have today. But that's not out of the realm of possibility. There were other animals that were kept in captivity this long ago, so maybe. Yeah.
I knew in Japan. I knew people that bears in captivity.
Wow.
Oh.
So,
What kind of bears? Like black bears?
oh, I didn't even know if it's black or
Asian
brown.
bears.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to write that down. I have not even thought about that.
But yeah, they would get bear cubs and raise them in
Wow.
captivity. So.
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
The Unangax Bridge, the bears you guys, parts you guys found there, were they near like kind of some human evidence, like a settlement or camp, or were there any like cuts on the bones?
There were cuts on the bones for sure, and they were found at, I don't know as much about the site itself as I do about the Margaret Bay, because this is fairly new, like we just got it a couple months ago. But yes, the Unangax Bridge site is also like a house that we were found at.
So obviously the bridge site is about 2,800 years after the Margaret Bay site.
Yeah.
Are you guys looking into, and actually, so I guess the first question I have is, would we have expected sea ice to have receded during that 2,800 years? And then if so, would we expect sort of genetic drift if they would have sort of stayed in place, like drifting genetically away from, more on the peninsula? Is that something you guys can measure?
Yes.
Yes to both.
Yes to both. So we were just looking at this previously. So this is 3,000 years ago. There's a cooler point, like relative to this like warmer time. So yeah, it is possible. I would have guessed that the ice would have essentially receded by then. And if it was a population that was established and then was no longer connected to the nearby islands, yeah, we would be able to see genetic drift, which would cause lower population genetic diversity and effective population size. So when I get those better genetic data for deeper DNA sequencing, I'll be able to answer those questions. The other thing about those bones is that I kind of knew, we sort of knew that they were younger because the DNA quality was a lot better. So we do have a lot more sequences for those, and we probably will be able to see heterozygosity better in those samples. Yeah. Any question?
Yeah, I was just kind of related to the sea ice. Just could you briefly just touch on the timing in which, how far south they think it went, and the timing of that, and et cetera? Is that just?
Well, I mean, we don't have any like ice cores. You know how they can take like Woods Hole Oceanographic Organization can take cores and look at the organisms in there and see if sea ice was likely to be present. So we don't have a core for the Bering Sea right now. The best information we have is pollen data, and this is actually from Southeast Alaska. So we're sort of assuming that the timing would be the same for the onset of cooling. And so it is around this 5,000 year period that the neoglaciation onset happened. It's like the exact timing is really hard to know. But this is sort of like a really rough estimate based on our data, like this kind of information that the sea ice reached basically on Alaska, whereas it had reached Pribilofs before. So this is really like really rough, actually, based on, and these information were based on Nanette and Davis study where they found the different tool set and the sea ice mammals. So these are the pieces of information we have. So Woods Hole is soon going to try and get a core from close offshore, and that will give us more information about this potential cooling and like hopefully some more resolution on that.
So, is there a genetic link between the brown bear bones here, down here, and the grizzly bear population on Unangax Island?
Well, that's what I'm testing next. I can't answer that yet because I don't have enough nuclear sequence data. We can't tell from just mitochondrial sequences because they're too similar. But that's the next question that I have. Yeah. So then if they are most closely related, then that could be either hunting or an expansion, I think.
Stay tuned for the next
Yeah,
episode.
but I'm thinking if they are from more like, it's not like if they're from like Kodiak Island, that's too far. I would think for a long distance hunting trip. So if they're more like Kodiak bears, I would assume that it's more like a trade item. So, but we'll see. To be determined.
Is that gonna be more like lab work, or do you need to collect more data?
No, we actually don't need to do more lab work. So we've already made like 6 different genomic libraries from each sample to make sure that we had enough samples that we don't need to remove any more sample. It's just a matter of now that we have the preliminary sequences, we can see based on the percentage of endogenous content, we know how much more sequencing we need to get the coverage that we want. So it's not more lab work, luckily. It's a lot of work. So when I return to Oklahoma after this trip, then I'm going to send them out for more sequencing. So basically just a sequencing core. We have all of the raw material that we need, so that's good. It should happen quickly.
Big fancy stuff on a supercomputer. That's your answer.
And a lot of, the mammal genomes are huge, so it takes a really long time and a lot of computing power to assemble the genomes and look at the variation. So that will take me, I will be the limiting factor of it. Okay.
So, are you comparing mittens and Unangax?
That's what I would like to do.
Okay.
Yeah, just to see what sort of frequency of bears that they have there. Yeah, and I'm not sure. Maybe someone in the room knows about Sykes and Unangax that we might be able to compare to because I don't know. Ginny's not here. Ginny would know.
There's not much.
It's not much. Okay.
Right now, the genetic sampling that we have for Unangax is actually a bear skin from the Smithsonian, so it's a modern bear. It's not an ancient bear.
Yeah.
That is a good next step.
This question is actually what it is about. I was wondering, do you have any nearby sites where bears were not thought to live during this time, where there's evidence of trading, that bears have been traded to those islands and stuff?
No, not that I know of. No. There is evidence of so there are no polar bears in Iceland, but there is evidence that people were collecting polar bears every once in a while. The sea ice came adjacent, so there is like a precedent for that kind of an event happening where sea ice reached further and people were starting to hunt them.
So with you saying it, that, I mean, the lab work is pretty much done,
Yeah.
and you just send it out for
Mm-hmm.
nuclear
Yes.
testing? So it's not so much a question of if, but when?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
So if we handed out and we're going to get it, it's a matter of when testing stuff.
Exactly.
Come back. Give another talk.
Yeah, we would love to. That would be great.
What about double evolution? Or down low where you find all these bears, or up higher, or where?
I actually don't know. They were in level 4 in the stratigraphy of the site, but the elevation of the site is sea level, so it's low. They weren't at high elevations. It would be interesting to see if there's any caves or something like that, but no, these are just sea level sites.
So it's level 4.
It's just the surface level. Oh, the archaeologists can help. It's like deeper as you go deeper. The first level is on the surface, and then the second, third, fourth, and it's like the different items that you're finding in the quality of the soil. I think defines a layer. Am I saying that correctly? Ish.
The deeper you go, the older it is.
Yes. So level 4 is old, and then that site was really nicely stratified. Yes?
So if, I guess the hypothesis is that we have a lot more sea ice across Alaska, would we be able to sort of test that hypothesis by the presence of other bones of other creatures that may also cross-fit the approach?
Yeah, this is a huge process, and a much bigger project than us. And in fact, Brandon was saying that next spring, in June, I guess, they're going to open at the museum like a whole exhibit about the sea ice hypothesis and all the pieces of evidence that would support that.
Because they also found ring seal and walrus at this site, so you could theoretically do this exact same project on the walruses or on the ring seal to kind of do the same thing and try and figure out how they were genetically related to modern day populations. Bears are just cooler, in my opinion.
So specifically though with like brown bears, that sort of suggests that there was some sort of interaction, there was sort of an indigenous population.
Brown bears are a little bit more blurry than polar bears, just because for polar bears to be here,
It must
you
be ice.
pretty much have to have the sea ice or like a really, really good boat, which they did have and they still have them. But for brown bears, the island is close enough that it is more reasonable to expect that they would have just kind of gone like multiple times for these hunting trips, or repeated trade with local tribes that live in this area. But it also could have been the sea ice, because if the sea ice is allowing the polar bears to get there, then it's definitely allowing for the brown bears to get there. So brown bears could have been anything, but polar bears most likely is the sea ice.
And it shouldn't have been, it wasn't like during like Beringia when there was like so much ice trapped up that the land was connected. The sea level shouldn't have been that low, if that's what you mean. But the presence of ice could have created sort of like an island pass.
So what is it going to take, or what would it take for you to get that answer, I guess? If it was, if the bones here were from trade, or if it was from an ice bridge?
A lot more, I guess, additional pieces of information. The ice core will help, hybridization information will help, how the most closely related population will help. All of these will be additional pieces of information, but we honestly might never know exactly for sure. It's really hard to estimate things in the past. There's not a ton of research in this area, and so we're just trying to get as many pieces of evidence as possible. And that's one of the nice things about our lab group. It's really interdisciplinary, so you can't answer these kind of questions without working with all kinds of different scientists from different disciplines. I'm not an isotope scientist. We work with an isotope scientist that helps us to interpret our isotope data. I'm a more DNA person, Kaylee's more of a bone morphology person. She's a people person and a bone person. We need everybody.
Evidence of trade is also kind of found through the culture, and unfortunately so much of this area has been colonized and they've lost a lot of their history. So evidence of trade is really blurry. It's not as clear as we might be able to see in other areas, because it's gone, unfortunately.
Also, I think polar bears spend more in green animals than
Yes.
bears.
Oh yeah.
Can you see that in the bones?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we would look at the isotopes. But if you mean just by the shape of the bones, it would only be evident in their teeth.
Yeah.
In their skull. Yes?
Did they find any bear bones down by Nikolsky? Because that was a big old site.
Not sure.
Where is Nikolsky?
Yes,
Next island now.
Oh.
Not sure. And I don't know if there are sites there. Maybe someone else in the room can answer that question. Yes.
Did I see on the map there that the Pribilof Islands had, like St. Paul's George had evidence of the polar bears being there as well?
Yes, they do.
So that was previously known, so
Yes.
it almost sounds like a very similar case.
Yeah. Yeah, they have a really nice, like a cave hole where they found mammoth and polar bear, which was Pleistocene, so older. But they also had historical polar bears there that were hunted and they're in the Smithsonian, so I did sequence those. So it would be interesting to see if our bears are closely related to those. I'm hoping that we get good enough data to tell. So and I can't remember exactly the time that those bears were found. I want to say it was in the 40s, so not that long ago. I mean, and sea ice, as you know, continues to recede, but like in historical records, sea ice was hitting the Pribilofs.
Is that like the farthest south they found like polar bear remains, evidence of polar bears that weren't changed?
They don't really find much evidence of any polar bears anywhere because they live on the ice and they die on the ice. So it's really rare to find polar bears, even in cultures that do harvest them that are older than like historical sites. Every once in a while they find them due to like erosion in the northern slope areas, but this far south, no. They're really, which is why we're so excited. They're very rare and difficult to find.
So was the percentage of bear bones at Margaret Day, or was it 2-3%?
Yeah.
And is that number of bones or NMI, or do you?
It was the NMI.
So of the total
Yeah.
bones?
Of the total like identified, so of
Identified.
23,000 faunal pieces, 5,000 were identified as species. Of that 5,000, it was 2% that were identified as bear.
So how does that compare to where we know there were bears
Exactly.
on this?
That I don't know. That I'm not sure about, which is why I want to talk to Ginny about if there's similar sites in Unangax Island, for example, to see how that percentage is compared.
Useful.
It would be a very useful comparison. Yeah.
Is carbon dating the same as isotope?
Radiocarbon dating is C14, and then C13 and N15. Those were the bulk stable isotopes for diet. That's the same, essentially. Yeah. We get them from the same, so we send them to UC Irvine, and from the same machine, we get both pieces of data. Which is good because those are expensive. It's more expensive than DNA, it's like $300. Yeah, so we take, this is why we preserve them with photography and 3D images, because we take like chunks pretty big. Because if we want to get radiocarbon dates, it's like 200 milligrams. And for DNA extraction, it's 100 milligrams of material. And we like to have one remaining just in case. So that's how much material we take. And we grind it up. They're really hard. They're old bones, so we use a Dremel with a diamond head drill bit and zoom off a piece and then smash it with a hammer. That's how we subsample.
Very scientific.
Yeah. It's a lot of loud smashing in the hood. Yes. Anything else?
So is it just bone remains that you're finding? Something else that survives?
Oh, I don't know anything about tools, but I know that they were finding tools in the sites as well at the same date. But I cannot answer any questions about tools. Don't ask me.
But if you mean like in terms of like meat or tendon or
Oh
fur,
yeah,
that's
no,
just a great
it's all
thing.
gone. Yeah, so just bones from the animals. Yeah, just bones. Teeth and bones.
Yeah, one final question. Do you guys know like, is there evidence of bears like swimming far distances?
Yeah, they can swim really far, but polar bears are better swimmers.
Polar bears. But could that be a possibility of kind of island hopping across?
Yeah, yeah, they could. So I mean, it's not. If there was sea ice, it's not necessarily that it was like touching the shore. If it was close enough, sometimes the polar bears do come to land and they can swim, not 200 miles probably. But yeah, they are really good swimmers.
So polar bears were found. We don't know exactly if they were treated for those purposes.
Yeah.
So if they, I guess, how south do polar bears go? Would that be pretty south if they were here without?
Very, very far south.
Yeah.
So in terms of sea ice, they go about as far south as St. Paul Island, as we were mentioning earlier. But even today, they don't really go that far south.
Not at all.
Today, they're just really up on the northern slope.
Even St. Lawrence, they don't have as many as they used to.
So they're usually on the mainland. They come down into Canada, and Canada, they're seeing them go further south on the mainland, but they're not really supposed to be there, and that's more of like a starvation-driven thing. because of climate change rather than like a natural habitat type thing. But here, yeah, they're not supposed to be down here at all. So it's really weird that they're here.
And that's where they're seeing this hybridization happening now in Canada, because grizzly bears are moving further north because it's warmer there, and polar bears are also spending more time on land because the sea ice is not like locking in. They can't be hunting on the ice, so they're overlapping more, and they're hybridizing now in Canada. You probably saw in the news they call them grizzly bears because it's cute, and but they don't. I mean, it's okay for brown bears to have polar bear genes because we know that this has happened a lot of times through their evolution, and brown bears are like human beings. They're like omnivores. They're really plastic. They're generalists. They can adjust their strategies for living. So polar bear genes don't mess them up. But polar bears cannot have brown bear genes, so it's never a polar bear mother. Their cub wouldn't survive because their color is off. They're this like sandy cinnamon color, and it's really important that polar bears are white. They're much more adapted to like a narrow niche than brown bears are.
So is it a possibility that the DNA that you collected could have been hybridized?
Totally, yeah.
Oh,
It could be.
wow, okay. Okay.
And for that, we really need to get like deeper sequencing data because that would be something that hasn't been shown here before, and so we have to make sure our evidence is strong before we say something like that.
And that's also why I took measurements of some of the hybrids that were at the Smithsonian. I was really hoping that they were going to kind of cluster by themselves, but to be expected, the hybrids are in fact hybrids, and they're just kind of all over the place. So that didn't tell us anything. But yeah, we were thinking the same thing.
Alright, it looks like we are just about finished. So thank you everyone once again. Thank you to our presenters. Tonight, I hope you hopefully learned something new, or at least have some new questions to ponder as you leave tonight. So upcoming museum events, we do have another program next week. We are on a hot streak of about a month worth of the program every single week. Next week we have the local environmental observers. They're having a small open house, and they're introducing a new kiosk, so you can become a local environmental observer. So that is next Thursday at 6:30. Let me just double check so I don't give you the wrong day. But that will be at the museum. So the kiosk is being installed in the front of the museum, and so that's where the open house will be as well. It is next Wednesday, August 9th. So you'll see I have started putting flyers up around town, so you'll see those. It's on KCB's calendar. So please feel free to come next week, and we hope to see you there. And beyond that, thank you again and good night.
Who's got my prints?
I think you came back.
Oh, you've got them. Thank you. Yeah, they're doing it.